Welcome to Power Stroke Maintenance. In this episode, we are going to be talking with John Arriola. John is the sales manager at AccuTune. He has worked at AccuTune for almost 4 years and done more than 10 years in the off-road industry. So today we're going to talk with John about how you can improve the ride quality of your Ford Super Duty and how custom shock tuning can help you achieve that end. John, thanks so much for being willing to do this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on.
But I'm really curious, just to get started, what led you to work in suspension tuning or in truck suspension?
Yeah, really when it comes down to it, I'm a hobbyist myself. I have a 1994 Toyota pickup, been building that since high school. I'm much older than that at this point, but really what it is having a vehicle, building it yourself, and needing a way to maintain it and making sure that it's going to be at the best performance and really taking care of it. So that's something that I worked at auto parts stores. I worked at other competitors here in the industry, but shock building is really a passion that I really picked up on over the years.
That's really cool. And is it a Tacoma or is it one of the old Tundras?
It's a 1994 Toyota pickup. So
Oh,
pre-Tacoma,
even pre,
yep,
okay.
yep.
Wow.
It's long
Okay.
traveled. It is just an absolute beast off-road. It's so much fun.
So do you find you have it set up more for like smashing whoops, or do you do crawling with it more, or like what kind of off-road driving is your favorite, or just like a little bit of everything?
It's mostly like going fast, exploring places, a lot of desert sand washes, things like that in Southern
Mhm.
California. That's like Ocotillo Wells, Superstition, areas like that. If it had a little bit more power, it could do Glamis, things like that as well, but it's absolutely set up for all that.
That's awesome. I mean, you kind of led me right into the next question I was going to ask you, which is what's your personal car and slash truck setup like?
Yep.
So is that also your daily, or do you have another
Oh,
car that you daily?
no way. It was my
Okay.
daily for a long time. So
Okay.
um, it got to the point where it was long traveled, leaf springs in the back, welded rear differential, things like that.
Yeah.
I daily drove it like that for probably 10 years.
No
Finally
way.
got to the point where I was just like, hey, I can't do this anymore. It makes a ton of noise. It burns through tires. It's annoying
Right.
to the neighbors. So I have a 2011 Nissan Titan now that has a
Okay.
custom suspension, things like that too. But that's my
Cool.
daily. The Toyota is going to be more for just desert stuff.
Right. It's like the dedicated project truck now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So what else do you have on your setup? Like, what are you running for tires? What motor does it have? Is it still running the original motor that came in the 94?
At this point, yes. So it is still running the 22RE, which is the four-cylinder.
Okay.
That poor thing is tired. It is so beat up. We have a V8 ready to go into it, but of course that's
Okay.
money, time, and effort that goes into it.
Right.
The truck is at a really good stage right now where suspension-wise, it's very happy with the power it makes. Very soon it's going to get some sort of Toyota or Lexus V8, whether it's the 1UZ or 2UZ. That's
Okay.
from a Lexus LS400 or a Tundra. But that's going to take a lot more cage work, and that's when I'm going to do a full trailing arm setup in the back, and that's a whole another animal at that point.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay. So it's like you're kind of on the edge of having it be like taking it to the next level and you're just kind of holding out a little
Yeah,
bit to get there.
exactly. Because that's one of those things. Just like any sort of suspension setup that we'd be talking about here for Super Duties, any sort of truck that we're talking about, it's a composition. So it's trying to make sure that you have all the right parts all together, so you can do it all right once.
Right. Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Moving more to like your work at AccuTune, how did you end up working for AccuTune Offroad? I know you'd said you'd worked at some parts stores prior to, but
Mhm.
like what made you end up there and stay there for so long?
So the way I really got here was I've worked in the industry. I've done parts counter type stuff. I've done international wholesale. Um, I've done a lot of consultation for four-wheel drive conversion companies, things like that. Uh, so working here, I actually knew Ryan Raker during those positions. I knew what he was
Okay.
doing. I was aware of his position in the industry. So when it came time to basically move from those other companies as they went to new management, I knew that basically I wanted to work somewhere that was very technical, really cared about customers, and really had the same beliefs that I did about really making this accessible to everybody to have that
Right.
best ride quality.
Right. What can you tell us about the history of AccuTune Offroad?
So Ryan basically worked in the industry for a long time. He worked at different suspension companies, designing shocks for basically places like Progressive Suspension, which did a lot of motorcycle stuff, and he did other designs for other companies too.
Okay.
Has a lot of patents to his name.
Hmm.
So basically taking off-road shock absorbers from his college days where he was doing things with the Polygoats, Cal Poly, basically taking that and finally doing shock tuning for Fox, King, and Swayaway products while they were still big with what we were doing. So he basically took that information and made that to where it was accessible for everybody that had a project. So that company built, got more specialized with Fox and King, and really went from just being off-road only, like a Jeep buggy, Toyota buggy, things like that, to being all kinds of vehicles for everybody.
That's cool. And that like system that he built that's the formula that AccuTune uses to tune shocks for customers.
Yeah, and I will tell people that really the best part about it is that it starts at a scientific level. So we're going to start with formulas, we're going to start with numbers and things like that. But what we're going to build up to is then it gets put into a truck. So it's not just going to be on paper. We actually take those tunes and we put them to use and we figure out what works in the real world. So it's not just trusting a number. It's not saying and pushing up our glasses that, hey, it's going to be correct. We actually put it to the test and put it through a test.
Right. So as much as it is theoretical in that like you do have a model that dictates where the tune goes, it's all based on testing and real world application.
Oh, absolutely. You can have the best idea and the best plans ever, but then you go out and try it and, hey, this does not do exactly what you thought it would. Maybe it does great in the whoops, but now it feels terrible in washboard or vice versa. So you got to be able to fix that up.
The next place I was going to go was like, what is the difference between the shocks you sell versus something off the shelf? And this is something I think is kind of important for people to understand, right? Because they'll see kind of the AccuTune, Fox reservoir shocks, and they're like, what is the difference between the reservoir shocks I buy at a parts store that are direct from Fox versus what you guys do? So I just like to give people an understanding who may not be familiar with custom tuning, how AccuTune fits into the suspension industry.
Yeah. So really the two things that we have to be able to separate is, so the physical part that we're selling is the same as anything that you can buy anywhere else. But the difference is the people behind it. So we're taking a product that you can buy anywhere else. And the good thing is, even if you did buy it from somewhere else, you can come to us and we will put that same magic into your shocks that we can do if we sold it to you. The difference would be is that if you bought it from us, we do it for free. If you buy it from somewhere else, we do have a very small service charge that we do for that. But no matter what, we can take those shocks and we can make them ride the way that you experienced in your previous video with your truck. So it's not the difference of the part itself, per se. It's the difference of what gets done to it before it ever reaches your door.
Right. Again, if someone wanted to buy shocks from you, they're getting that custom tuning as like the free value added service. But if someone already owns Fox reservoir shocks or Kings, they could come to you and be like, hey, I want to do a custom shim and I want to tweak my ride, profile and feel and kind of work with you guys on that.
Absolutely. And that's something I really encourage. Like when we're talking about Super Duties, things like that, there's really top name brands that we deal with. And that is something where you can buy a shock from them and that's fantastic. I hope you do buy kits that are, again, composed, that go together very well. But over time, it's eventually going to need service. And you may realize at that point that maybe it wasn't fully optimized for you. And that's not a fault of any other manufacturer.
Right.
They may not have a business model or a setup to be able to cater to every single individual customer like we are for this particular setup, which is shock absorber. So whether you bought it from us or you bought it from a very reputable brand that uses these high quality products, it will be able to ride really well for your vehicle.
I guess just getting right into it, could you walk us through the shock tuning process?
If we start like from the way beginning of it, you basically have to start with something. So you have a baseline. So if we talk about a customer experience, let's say you have an off-the-shelf set of shocks for your Super Duty, and you're feeling that, hey, in these situations it does fantastic, in these situations it doesn't. We want to see basically a list of those issues that you're having. That way we can see if we do this kind of tuning change to a shock, because we're going to open up a shock and change valve shim. But if we make one change, it's going to affect other variables as well. So we're going to balance your pros and your cons and see what we can really boost to the best without putting too many cons on the other end of it. So In your video with your truck, you described how basically it worked really well through potholes, things like that. But then you also acknowledged too that spring rate may affect small bumps and small feelings on the road,
Right.
things like that.
Right.
We might be able to say that we can make that feel better. But what may happen is that your pothole performance actually decreases.
Right.
So if a
Right.
customer says that, hey, I can deal with the performance here, but I want it to be better here, we may make changes that actually customizes that for each customer.
Right. So it's like a bit of give and take as you're working through the tune, because a customer may want something, but the shock can't do everything. Like you were even saying, your other tunes that you guys offer, the tune I got would be, way better for on-road driving, unless I was going to try to make my truck into like a Baja pre-runner, in which
Oh
case
yeah,
you would stiffen the shocks way up. Um,
absolutely.
and it's really interesting you bring that up, because my concern that I had shared with you at the beginning of the tuning process, I shared my axle weights, and then it was those big impacts. It was the body roll going over like expansion joints, which is a huge issue. The lurch feeling that Super Duties have, it's caused, by that really stiff sway bar in the front, and the truck, when one wheel drops, it just whips one way. Same thing with, potholes or like big rollers on the highway. You're driving 70, 80 miles an hour on I-70, and the road is terrible, and there's just these giant head-sized potholes, and they just will eat your entire axle. And so
Yep.
yeah, so it was really cool to see that. And I think in the video, there was the section where my brother and I were like freaking out, because that it was like this really weird, we were on I-76, and there was this really weird like step up where the expansion joint, the bridge is like separating from the road. And yeah, just Denver road things.
Yep. I saw that part of the video and I was like, what the hell did they hit? Like,
Yeah,
what is going
yeah.
on?
Yeah, it's like it's just the expansion joint and the pavement of like separated by maybe 2 or 3 inches, and it's enough where it like without the custom tune, I felt like my head was just about to get thrown through the glass. And I think there's a lot of folks that will kind of resonate with that. It's that kind of uncontrolled lurch, and man, the tune that you guys did, it just completely eliminated that. Like it was uncanny. I honestly couldn't believe it. So it was really, really cool to see that.
And honestly, that's my favorite part of the video. As much as I absolutely love data, I love graphs. Like, we are obviously very much a part of that. Honestly, every person's individual reaction and just that light bulb going off of really, this is what it feels like, and this is the difference that this makes,
Right.
is really the
Right.
coolest. And it's going to be different for everybody.
Right.
I want to address real quick that that's one of the things that we want to hear about. So let's say that part of the freeway is your common commute, that is something that you hit every single day. That becomes a pain point for our customers, and that becomes kind of a memory that everybody's kind of, whether they consciously or unconsciously know, they're trying to solve it.
Right.
So we want to hear from customers, hey, I go along a certain part of the freeway and it just gives me this really bad separated feeling where it lurches me and almost hits my head against the side window. Or, hey, it's really washboarded feeling. It does this or that. Because we want to customize a shock package that basically works and helps to solve that for you.
Right.
But if it's not going to, we want to recommend something that will. But if we don't know that you have that issue, we won't know that we need to tune for it. But we want to balance it as best we can. And one thing that I want to give a good baseline for too, because I'm going to make mention of it more as we talk, is high and low speed compression and rebound. When shock companies, manufacturers, anybody's describing these kind of things, high speed shaft movements are anything that makes the shock move quickly. So it's not a hard hit, a fast hit. So I describe that as like falling off a curb going 1 mile per hour. That's a 6-inch drop. That's 6 inches of shock movement that's happening very quickly. Low speed is anything that kind of sways or lurches. So you described how basically that expansion joint kind of lurches you side to side because of the sway bar happening. People might think that that's a high-speed shaft movement because it's happening at 70 miles an hour on the freeway, but we have to balance our low-speed damping when something like that is happening. So that's something where we want to balance that, but if we went too much on trying to fix that, it would make things even more washboardy than it felt initially.
Right.
That's one of those balances that when we talked about sway and how those things were affecting your truck, we tried to balance and make sure that everything was taken care of as nicely as possible with a finesse that didn't go too far. with that.
Right.
So
Right.
I'm going to keep saying high and low speed throughout the video.
Yeah.
So
That
that's going to
makes
be
sense.
my keystone there for everybody to kind of keep track of.
So you're saying that the lurch, because it's not necessarily like the speed of the vehicle or the speed you hit it, it's the speed of the shock movement is what's dictating whether it's a high or low speed movement.
Exactly.
Okay. So for that, to adjust for that lurch, you're saying that's where you would add more, that would be considered low speed compression damping is what you would add for that, and or rebound, right? Combination of the two. Yeah.
Combinations, lack thereof, or more of one or the other, depending on the style of bump. And that's what our shock tuners go through every single day, is trying to figure out with the type of vehicle, with the type of shock, what needs to be done in that particular situation.
Yeah, and just the fact that you guys take into account the customer's pain points, I think, is huge. Like, there's the ride profile. You kind of have those 3 options on your website, and then you ask the customer to provide the front and the rear chassis weight, so you kind of understand that. But the fact that you also take into account like what issue they're having is huge, right? You're not just asking for numbers and then you leave and take that away. You're actually taking like a human feedback portion of that tuning process into account and then building that into the shock package you're giving a customer, which is really, really cool.
Yeah, and the best part about it too is that honestly, if somebody doesn't have a lot of strong opinions about this and they just want something that rides really well, they could just give us numbers and we could just go with that. But we also have the level of care and really depth to this type of tuning that if you do have those preferences, we want to know about it because we might have other recommendations. So this is accessible and open to anybody, whether they want to be very involved in it or they just want a white glove, just basically give us what we need and we will make sure you're handled with that. So it's very open to any level of engagement, whether high level, low level, anything. And I will say too that like the manufacturers of shocks, and you can tune an IFP shock, but the difference is that we're going to be chasing it around like a goose chase. Because an IFP shock basically has everything contained in the same shock cylinder, it's basically going to create really big changes in nitrogen pressure. So for us, I like to use the analogy of it's kind of like when you have people visiting your house. If you have a studio apartment and you have everybody visiting your house, it's going to get kind of tight and stressful. So it can handle it, but you're kind of waiting for everybody to leave as soon as possible. But if you have a reservoir shock, it's kind of like having, hey, I have the guest house and you guys can stay over there. You're not going to share my bathroom. You're not going to brush your teeth with me. But you guys can come in when you want. You can go when you please. And everybody's happy and everything stays really stable with that. So it just enables us.
Right. So like to take that analogy even further, that's like by having more space, you're essentially reducing friction and oil heat then too, right?
You
by
are,
having more space. The family members aren't as prone to get into disagreements. Yep.
And then you start getting into external bypass shocks. It's like, hey, everybody has their own private entrance to the house. And you don't have to wake people up at night. You can completely bypass waking everybody up in the morning. So
okay.
I can go really far with analogies.
I can tell you, you've definitely talked about this quite a few times. No, I mean, but it's really helpful because that level of composure you get with the reservoirs is something, again, because you have more volume to play with. It's really, really noticeable. Let's say a customer, sends you guys, like they bought a set of Fox reservoir shocks, and let's say they send them to you. Like what happens when they arrive at AccuTune? Like what are your techs doing? Kind of what workflow do they have to get that customer sorted?
Oh yeah. So basically anytime a shock arrives at our facility, we really want to first check and make sure that everything arrived. Of course, inspect packages, make sure those are good. Open them up. We basically check in the product. We want to make sure that it's in good condition for the shock itself. So even before we start work, before we really get you stuck with paying for a service, we're going to make sure that it basically is in a good working order. So if it needs to be rebuilt, if it needs new bushings, if it needs anything like that, we're going to try to give you a report beforehand, before you're ever obligated to anything. So at that point, then we'll basically open up the shock and see what's already existing, make sure the internals are in good condition, and we can have that conversation at that point. But usually we want to already have a conversation about ride quality before they're ever sent to us, so that we can have a good idea, a plan, and from there our technicians can install the parts, get it cleaned up, and repackaged for you, usually within about a 1 or 2 week turnaround.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like you guys are really thorough and you definitely treat your customer suspension well. What are the benefits of custom tuning suspension for on-road driving? Because again, I even before this was like, obviously people who have custom builds like yourself, obviously you're going to try to get the best of the best that you can for that, because that is a purpose-built rig for, smashing whoops and, doing whatever you want to do with it. So I guess I'm trying to just, kind of make the connection here, like what some of those benefits are for on-road driving. So people who are like, oh, I don't really need custom tuning for on-road, like why would you bother? How would you respond to that?
That is an excellent question that I really face every single day. So really, the first thing to answer is, if you're watching this video, every single vehicle deserves remote reservoir, whether it's 100% on-road, 100% off-road, any mix in between, it deserves it. And really what you have to start with is even what a shock absorber is. First off, it's safety. If shock tuning didn't matter, we wouldn't have shocks on vehicles. The whole first starting point of a shock is to be safe for you. So when you hit the brakes, your springs compress, everything lurches forward, but a shock absorber helps to slow that down as well. So it gives resistance to your suspension, so that when you do put braking force into things, it actually starts to stop the vehicle and it stops that forward inertia. So even from a safety standpoint to start with, shock tuning absolutely is paramount with that. So moving from that, if your vehicle is safe and it performs the way that you want it to, it works as expected. That in itself is satisfying. When your vehicle stops when you want it to, it handles that bump like you expected it to. But when all those things go to the side, then we can finally get to comfort and fun, things like that. So if I can make your shock stiffer, but work better and ride more comfortably, all in the same package, it's having your cake and eating it too. So that's why shock tuning really is important. But the only way I can do that consistently is if you have a reservoir. Because those IFP shocks, because they're changing pressure so constantly, they're not being consistent. They're getting stiffer as you compress it. They're trying to jettison the shaft as they extend. You can't do anything consistently with an IFP shock. So they're perfectly fine for placeholders. They're perfectly fine if it performs the way that you enjoy it to perform. But if you really want something that's more comfortable and nicer for your ride, a reservoir shock is definitely where it's at.
That makes a lot of sense too, because when I was comparing these, the composure of the reservoir shocks was very apparent. They didn't get really chattery or seem to pack up when there was like a lot of chatter or when there were a lot of big impacts, like one after the other. And it felt like the deeper the shock got into the travel, like on bigger G outs or when I was driving faster, it was like there was no change. There was no variance or jittery feeling. And I almost feel like, because most of these trucks are riding around at between 8 and 10,000 pounds when they're loaded, and when you don't have control of 8,000 pounds, you know it. And I've been and tried the Ford OEM shocks. I've tried like Bilstein 4100s. I've tried the Fox IFPs and now AccuTune. And so I kind of in my mind have a trajectory I've been on, but also like an idea of what the different levels are. And it really is, like you said, it's way safer because of the predictability and just the consistency. So yeah, you touched on a little bit there, but what is the difference between the shocks that I had on my truck before we did this video series, the Fox IFPs, and the shocks that I got from AccuTune?
There's actually very little difference. Really, there's going to be some dimensional differences. So a positive towards remote reservoir shock is because that nitrogen pocket is separate from the shock body, you can actually make the shock length smaller. So the IFP shock that you had was actually about 1.5 inches longer compressed because it had to have a little area for the nitrogen pocket to be in that shock. So really the main difference between what you have now and what you had before is they changed those dimensions just a little bit smaller. They put a very small port at the top of the shock, which then led to a hose going to a reservoir on there. But in effect, almost all those parts could be shared between those shocks. Very similar piston rod, very exact same piston, valve shim's all the same. It's very similar in construction, but it's just the configuration has been changed, and that makes a huge difference to what it is.
And what is the purpose of the nitrogen charge? So you were saying in the Fox IFP, the nitrogen is inside the main shock body, whereas with the reservoirs, it's in the reservoir can.
The big importance to nitrogen is that it's a very stable gas. It's it's a high pressure, low volume gas. And when you have nitrogen or other pure gases like that, it's going to be free of contaminants or anything that could corrode the internals of the shock. So if you think about what just our normal breathing oxygen is composed of, it's a very large majority, over 80% of nitrogen. So why couldn't you just put air inside a shock? Well, you could, but then there's that 19% of other things that are inside the shock now. So you have moisture, other gases, things that might eat up the material or might make it act more radically in there. So could you technically use other gases like argon or other things like that? Sure, you definitely could. But nitrogen is just very plentiful, a lot more common, and it's extremely stable for what it is.
And that inside the shock, like what specific role does nitrogen play?
It basically acts as basically the initiating force. So you can have a twin tube shock, like is OEM on many vehicles, where you just have oil inside of two different chambers, and it's just going through holes, going back and forth. But the shock, instead of trying to be preemptive, is always going to be just very slowly reacting. And usually it's going to be pretty far behind because there is no brain to it. So the nitrogen almost acts like a very simple brain in the sense to where it's going to be giving forethought, trying to keep that tire towards the road, and it's going to try to put force on that oil. And it acts very much like, I describe it as like a brake system or a radiator system. When you have a radiator, when you think about not having pressure in your system, that fluid gets very hot very quickly and very easily. But when you put pressure inside your radiator system, it actually raises the boiling point of your fluid. So when you have nitrogen pressure on oil, usually through an internal floating piston, what's going to happen is it now takes even more heat than normal to make that oil actually boil, get unstable, or anything happen to that. So it helps to stabilize, it helps to cool, but not because it's a racing reservoir. It's just having a reservoir with more oil, more nitrogen, more stability is going to do that for you.
Right. So it sounds like heat is a big reason that a lot of the lower quality shocks have, what people will call like shock fade or damping fade, where, you kind of lose damping. It's because the oil's heated up over time.
Yeah, it really is. When you think about just like a shock piston, a piston rod, everybody thinks that basically a lot of the heat comes from the piston because that's rubbing against the body. But because there's basically a bearing housing that is touching the shaft constantly, that movement where it's actually touching the shaft and rubbing that part of it is where all of the heat's generated. So it's actually towards the bottom of the shock is where a majority of that is. So the heat never really actually makes it up to the reservoir unless you're just way burning up the shock like crazy. The majority of it is built at the shaft.
I never realized that connection between the nitrogen and like pressurizing the shock system. So that's super, super cool.
Yeah, because what could happen is, let's say you go to your reservoir shock, and I don't recommend this. Nobody do this, please. This is just me saying this.
Yeah.
I'm saying, Harry in particular, if you went and you depressurized your shocks, you'll notice, A, that they don't perform the same. They become extremely soft because there's no force on that oil. Next, you'll hear a bunch of sloshing inside, and that's the piston actually foaming the oil. It's basically cavitating. It's creating little voids within the oil and doing that. So just like in a radiator system where you get air bubbles if you didn't have it pressurized, basically this pressure from that nitrogen pocket is going to help keep things tight within that system and create a force against it.
I did not know that. Suppose that's why we're on this call. Yeah, super interesting. And for those of you who are watching, if you have questions for John or I, definitely drop them below, and between the two of us, we'll get back to you. I know AccuTune, you guys are pretty active on YouTube, and you have some great resources, so I'll definitely link to your channel in the description. But
absolutely,
yeah, man, that is really, really interesting. Obviously, we're talking about heavy duty trucks and a lot of people, when they buy the truck, they're either plowing with it or they're towing with it, or they're loading the bed with a lot of weight. So end of the day, the truck is, getting a lot of added weight put on it. So specifically for tuning, how would a custom tune shock improve the towing experience? Say someone has a fifth wheel, that weighs 16 to 20,000 pounds. What is the custom tune suspension going to improve with that towing experience?
Yeah. So a big part of that is, so we're talking about basically using these trucks in their proper sense, which is as a
Right.
commercial vehicle, as a
Right.
workhorse, things like that. And with that, there's variation. So when we have a nice custom tuned shock, we're trying to take all these variables in life and we're trying to remove as many as possible. So if we tune your shock, you get a really good basis, a foundation for performance in your vehicle. And that could be, like we said, performance can mean a bunch of different things. It could be a street car performance, it could be an off-road monster truck performance, but in this case, we want it to perform as a safe commercial vehicle, whether it's for private use or for business use on there. So having that custom tune will allow us that point to actually start from, so it feels safe and feels like it's going to work as it's supposed to.
For your shock packages, so I know you guys have 3, and you and I were going back and forth over email, and you were saying that like 98% of people are going to go with the 1. But can you just help us understand, like, what's the best way to think about the 3 tuning packages that AccuTune has on its website?
Yeah. So as customers and anybody who's listening to this is probably getting by this point, tuning is so diverse that I can't just have one tune for everybody. I can't have one tune that works for Super Duty guys, that works for a Toyota Tacoma, that works for a Sprinter van, or anything like that. So what we did was, instead of trying to give like some big 5-digit number tune for every single vehicle, for every weight range, for every symbol that we have, we basically created perspective. So the adventure tune, Harry, what you have in your shock, is basically the softest, street comfortable, performs very well for towing, for normal daily use, and can definitely do off-road still type tune. So that is going to cover most everybody with that. But as we start moving to a stiffer, more performance end of things, that's where you get our dual sport tune. So that's going to be like the guy that maybe this truck lives off-road. Like, it's on a property, the only way it goes anywhere is through a bunch of ruts, through a bunch of whoops, washouts, really bad stuff on there. So he wants a more aggressive ride quality because it's constantly bottoming out and having things. Maybe doesn't necessarily care about on-road riding as much. And then we go even further and we go to our trail tune, which is basically like, hey, this is a 37-inch tires or bigger vehicle, absolutely trying to just mash on rocks, just do things really aggressively, only cares about performance, does not care one bit about street ride quality. So we've created these perspectives because we don't want customers thinking that just because I have a Desert Pre-Runner truck, that I'm going to put my Desert Pre-Runner truck tune in your Super Duty. It's going to be something that's meant for what you do most often for it. So we've given it those 3 different perspectives instead of trying to say like, well, I'm going to give you a tune that I think is comfortable. And you go, I don't know if I want that SoCal Desert tune in my truck. It's like, well, I promise you I'm not going to do that.
Right,
I'm trying to describe the perspective that we're going to put into it. But
right.
I could do that tune if you really want to.
Right. That's really interesting that you describe them as like perspectives as opposed to, right, because everybody's is still going to be different, but it gives you like a starting place. And also, I'm sure it's easier to kind of communicate with people who aren't as, like myself, who aren't as technical and don't understand as much about shocks and what you can do with them, to kind of give them those 3 buckets where it's like, you'll be in this bucket, and obviously it's still going to be customized based on what you tell us you're looking for, but it gives people like a general understanding of what they're getting.
Absolutely. Yep. It gets us all on the same page, that we're not having any sort of ego about this at all. There's no like, hey, we think this is the best way of doing it. It's that, hey, we're going to use this perspective because this is what you want out of the vehicle. And that's what we're going to build it for.
I know you guys have on your website a couple different options for packages. So let's say someone's watching this video, they go into your website, they're going to see, obviously you have the leveling kits with the IBAC progressive coils and the progressive rate track bar. But they're also going to see my kit, which is just shocks and will fit a stock ride height truck. So would you be able to just take a little bit and like walk us through those different options and who, in your opinion, you think each one is for?
Yeah. So I will start off with stock vehicles are perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with a stock vehicle. But as you try to get more performance from your vehicle, you want to compose it in a way with parts that are going to complement that. So in your case, if you just want to do a shock package on a stock vehicle, that is going to be a huge difference to how this vehicle is going to perform. That's going to do amazing stuff. You're going to enjoy it and love it. But we have different packages like those leveling packages, the ones that include more parts, because as you start doing more with your truck or you want it to look a different way, there's going to be parts that help to make that work better together. So we will have leveling packages if you want to bring up the height of the vehicle. We will have packages that include a track bar. If you know that you're going to have any sort of off-road driving or anything that's going to upset the steering, if you've had historical issues of death wobble, things like that, that you know you're going to have to replace parts, we want to be there and offer those parts for you if that's going to make that vehicle work even better. So we have different quote-unquote levels, but there is no right, wrong, or indifferent to it. It's going to be the package that fits best for you and your situation.
That makes a lot of sense. So like if at some point I'm like, all right, I want to go to a dual sport and I'm thinking I'm going to be trying to take my, truck out and hit some washboard or smash some whoops, I would potentially go to the 2.5 King and then add a set of progressive coils to kind of soften up the front a little bit. Yep.
Absolutely. And really, our shock choices come down. There's two things that help us decide with customers. The first thing is going to be weight. The second thing is going to be use. So if a customer has a very stock weight vehicle, we're going to probably tend towards smaller shocks with that. Because if we just put the biggest shock possible on there, imagine somebody's trying to sell you a 3-inch diameter shock. That shock can never be tuned soft enough for that comfortable ride quality that you want. It's just not equipped for it.
Mm-hmm.
Just like that 2.0 shock would never be able to do what the 3.0 shock would do off-road. So we want to have the right tools for the job. And part of it is we're going to make sure that the weight of the vehicle and then the use match up for it on there. So in your case, like you said, I want to hit whoops, I want to do things more aggressive. The 2.5 shock is going to be better equipped for that, but it won't be as equipped to do comfort if that was your main goal.
Right. And is that the big difference between, I know this is like a huge generalization, but like between a more off-road focused package and the on-road package, is that you're adding more compression damping to the off-road package so that it keeps the vehicle up out of the bumps? Okay.
Yep. It's a really bad joke that I make, but basically if you're driving successfully through off-road, you are driving through the terrain. But if you're not doing well, the terrain is driving through you at that point. So if you're bottoming out, if the truck is basically hitting bump stops, it's moving the cab, you're jostling around, basically your head's hitting the window, as you described earlier, the terrain is now going through you. So in order for us to do a more aggressive tune, like a dual sport or a trail tune, I need to stiffen that suspension to a point where it doesn't bottom out. It doesn't have those issues with swaying or losing control. But if I make it that much stiffer, it's going to make other things more uncomfortable. But if the whole goal was for you to be able to go mash through whoops and do things like that, it was a worthy trade-off at that point. So that's shifting perspectives from, hey, I'm just a standard commercial truck driving guy, to, oh, now this is a monster truck that it's going to absolutely do monster truck things.
Got it. So at the end of the day, it's the application really dictates how you decide to tune the suspension.
Yep.
John, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. I know we went even longer than I was expecting, but I mean, it was super interesting. And I know I kept saying that. I think cool and interesting. I probably said that at least 20 times, but like I really mean it. Like this is awesome. And it's tough to find to find content like this, for these trucks. And it's a huge pain point. As I had told Mike, one of my most viewed videos is how to improve the ride quality of your Super Duty. It's just a huge pain point with these trucks. And I think you guys have like knocked it out of the park, both with the service you provide and just the quality of the tune. It really is like confidence inspiring is probably the best way I describe it. I don't feel like I need to like slow down for expansion joints now or speed bumps or water bars, so
No, that's
thank you.
perfect. And that's what we're here for. We're hoping that everybody realizes that this is not something that you have to get a PhD, a doctorate, some sort of engineering degree to be able to have an appreciation for it. If you just enjoy driving your vehicle and not having to white knuckle it, not having to prepare for that bump because it's going to hurt your kidney going through it, then good shocks are for everybody at this point. But we just want to make sure that that's open and available for everybody.
What else would you like to add before we wrap up? Anything else you'd like to share?
I would definitely say that AccuTune Offroad, we have a plethora of different applications we work with. So absolutely, the Super Duty is a really good one to talk about because it's such a pain point for comfort, because it's such a purpose-built vehicle. But we do a lot of stuff with smaller trucks, SUVs. We do everything from daily driver stuff all the way to full race with it. But we are really successful with it because we care about the customer. So if you come to us with an application, feel free to ask. We may have an application for it already. We might have a solution to assist you with it. Nothing is really too weird, but we will be very honest with you if there's a product for it and if we can do something for you. But we really want to talk to customers and help you not just with your Super Duty, but maybe with your 4Runner, with your Tacoma, with your F-150, with any vehicle you have. All these principles can go to any vehicle.
Awesome. That's cool. Well, yeah, I'll definitely leave the link to your guys' website and just so people can find and browse. And AccuTune also has a bunch of really good documentation YouTube videos on just how to understand shocks work. So I'll be sure to put a link. They have a great set of already made content that is in both in blog and video form. So I'll definitely link to that. And John, thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I've learned so much, and so I hope others have as well. I know I mentioned at the outset, I have been a hobbyist for suspension just because of like mountain biking for a while, but this whole kind of adventure getting into actually getting to custom tuning for a vehicle is the first time I'm doing this. So it's been an awesome experience.
Yeah, we appreciate you. We appreciate our customers who have experience with things. We want to join in right there with you. Don't be insulted if we start out on one-on-one with customers, but we definitely want to participate in this with you and make sure that everybody's having fun.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you again. And leave comments below if you have questions. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe both to my channel and AccuTune's, and we'll see you next time here on Power Stroke Maintenance.